How are you feeling about where things stand? And especially given, that I interviewed you all those years ago where it maybe seemed a little bit more elusive.
Well, it's been elusive for how many years? I'm feeling really positive. I'm really feeling positive about the moment and some of the indicators for me that have been kind of elusive, we'll say. So, for example, the enthusiasm women, for example, who are just very excited about this moment. I'm sure that we had a certain level of enthusiasm around Hillary Clinton, but I don't think it was quite the same kind of energy that I'm hearing, and the breadth of it, or maybe the diversity of it, might have been quite different. I'm not sure. I think we were all very excited and very disappointed that she was not able to become the first woman president of the United States. And I'm glad that women didn't become just entirely jaded and just kind of withdraw and sort of move into someplace else. And the other thing, a point of reference I have is young people, the enthusiasm of young people who are participating. They're interested, they're excited. They're coming from, at least those who are in college, and some people of the generation Gen Zs, and so forth, are coming out of this period where I think that they believe that their voices were not being heard. They are seeing in Vice President Harris an opening to be heard.
Mhm,
And that's very exciting. I
mhm,
think women are coming in for a different reason. I think they're seeing a new opening because they're seeing how dire some of the consequences of not
mhm.
protecting women are, in fact, and that we're on the verge of an era where those rights and protections that we thought we had will be consistently taken away. It's not exactly what young people are feeling, but I think it's related because young people also were somewhat jaded because they never really felt like their voices were part of the things that they had come to understand as their rights and their protections. Those people who might have felt disenfranchised or left out or ambivalent, are feeling now I can return or I can go to the Democratic Party for the first time because they're offering the kind of hopeful future that I would like to have. And
Mhm.
I would like for my children to have and my grandchildren to have.
I think, one of the things that we keep hearing over and over is we can't get complacent though, because, and I think we all can hark back, or I don't even like to look back on how it felt when Hillary lost. But we do know that we were all feeling optimistic and positive, and not to be a downer or anything, but like we do know that we have to keep the energy and momentum up. What will it take, just to quote the
Mhm.
book, to really make sure we get past the finish line this time to elect her?
Well, you're right. We have to keep the energy up. And I think you've got a candidate that just reflects that energy. I think even her choice of Walz as a vice president reflects a different kind of energy, but a real energy. I mean, when you see the two of them, you can understand how they could connect, feel like that they could work together for a common purpose. It will be easier to keep that energy up. They come off as two people who are deeply committed, but they don't necessarily come off as being inaccessible. That's no comment on any other candidate in the past. I think we've had some really good candidates in the past, and I think Hillary Clinton was a great candidate. I mean, the most qualified person in that
Mhm.
race, the most qualified person of all the candidates that had come before her, and that's again, no commentary on some of the great people who have led this country and done great things. And it's no comment on Joe Biden either. But I think what we are witnessing now is it's just a coming together of the elements that maybe we hadn't been looking for or thinking were important, And we're realizing how important those elements are, and enthusiasm and energy, this positive outlook. I think it was a muscular patriotism, one that seems very sincere, that is being shown in Kamala Harris.
One of the things that was interesting when I interviewed Speaker Pelosi last week, and she was talking about this kind of balance we have to play between like celebrating that, of course, she could be our first woman president, and the fact that she is a woman, with balancing the fact that it's not that don't vote for her just because she's a woman, that maybe we overstep that a little bit, possibly with Hillary, and that this time we really need to just focus on the fact that she actually is also the most qualified and be the best candidate, the best vision. It's sort of both those things, but we also can't ignore the fact that she would be making history.
Yeah, I mean, it's just ridiculous to say, but for the fact that she's a woman, she wouldn't be a candidate. Though all of those things, they're combined. You can't take away one aspect of her identity,
Yep.
whether it's female or Southeast Asian descent, African descent. I mean, all of those factors are part of who she is, who she has always been, contrary to what Donald Trump might say about her being Black. I mean, I think, and we don't have to parse people up in that way. And I don't think anybody in their right mind could look at a Hillary Clinton and say, oh, she's only a candidate because she's a woman. Again, most qualified and most experienced and just smart and dedicated. So I think that's another kind of trope that we'll have to deal with. I think President Obama had to deal with that. Well, he's only there because, people wanted to elect a Black president. Well, that's not ever going to be enough. We know that neither gender or race is ever going to be enough to qualify someone for the presidency. We can't take those factors completely off the table either, because that's a part of how people live and exist and who they are, how their character has been formed. All of that needs to be taken into account. This time, I think we've seen it again, and we're responding appropriately.
And that was one of the other things that obviously happened with Hillary, and we're seeing again when you're perhaps a woman of color, there are these biases and commentary, sexist and racist commentary that often you wind up being subjected to. And obviously you would understand that because you yourself had to confront some of that. How do you think we should go about confronting that? What advice would you have for, Kamala Harris or really any other diverse leader that would have to encounter this? And what can we do to sort of combat this overall? Because it seems like this is always a factor.
That's the one thing that I'm working on in a couple of ways. I'm teaching a class on racial constructions over history, politically, to really begin to pull those things out and expose them for what they are. The things that have held people back who were very well committed, very well qualified, but who couldn't get beyond those things. I'm also looking at it in terms of how AI is presenting her. I've worked with a student last year on a project on AI again that, puts out basically racist or sexist materials in its portrayal of women candidates. So we've got a lot to do, not only culturally, but also in terms of technology that keeps spinning out those same kinds of tales and tropes. I think the first thing really is to call it out and expose it. I think that there has been a hesitancy to say these things are racist or they're sexist, because then the people response is, oh, they're always crying or whining about racism or sexism, and this is not what it's about. So I think when you hear it over and over, when you hear things like, oh, she's a DEI candidate, or she slept her way to this position, it's just hard to ignore what you're talking about. It's pure sexism and racism right there in front of you. And that we're better than that as a country. So I think that's got to be something that we don't just ignore and say, okay, she'll get by with, even though she's going to face these things, and she knows how to handle them. What we should be aiming for is to make sure that that happens less and less and less. Because, and this is where I talk about young people, we want them to want to be part of these processes. But I think for many of them, they're just turned off by this kind of rhetoric, by this kind of language and attacks, and just don't want to be a part of a system that allows that without challenging it. One way I think to point it out is to ask the question when you hear it, and when you ask people who just don't see the real problem or see it as a huge problem, is to say, you know, would these kinds of stories or fictions be created about a white male? And we can attack people, records, their behavior, but to attack their identity is something that I think we need to move beyond as a country, whatever the setting is, but certainly in terms of our political leadership.
It's kind of stunning how, like, overt it is right now. Like, as you were just talking about some of these comments, whether it's, the turned black or the DI hire. I mean, some of this stuff, or even this stuff about her laugh or how she looked. I mean, some of this is
Oh,
just like
yeah,
the
the laugh
playbook.
thing. I've got a whole list of them. The
Well,
laugh
that I
thing.
love that she's leaning into the laugh, and even that Hillary brought it up. Like, what's part of it is contagious, and of her energy is her joy. It's a positive.
And why are we asking a question about Donald Trump? I mean, have you ever heard him laugh? I mean, does he understand what laughter is? And how do you relate to somebody who you don't hear laughing? I mean, and this
Yeah,
to me is a plus. It shows
yeah.
that what we're dealing with is a real
Mhm,
human being with
mhm.
real human sentiments that we
Yeah,
all have. We want to be
I
looking at
agree.
the humanity of our candidates for leadership.
Absolutely. Remembering, I was reflecting back when I first interviewed you, and we were talking about why we hadn't had a woman president. I think the quote was, because we've had a skewed concept of what leadership looked like, and leadership in our minds, unfortunately, has a gender, and the gender is male. And then you said, I think we can't discount the role of culture in shaping our concept of what women can do. But in the context of this conversation, I think what's interesting is that it's redefining, not just for women, but for everyone, what leadership can look like. Leaders
Mhm.
can laugh. That's a good thing,
Right.
or be human and all of these things. So, how do you feel about that in terms of the opportunity that we have by seeing more diverse leaders to also transform for men too, what leadership can look like, which I think the world would benefit from?
Well, I think that's one of the reasons that Kamala is so well paired with Tim Walz. They both are human. They're not caricatures. And I think from my sense of how I see them, it shows a level of sincerity
Hmm.
in what they're saying that we are all looking for. We want not only our people to be human, but we want them to be sincere and to be honest. And as somebody who's willing to laugh out loud in public is showing a level of honesty that it is genuine, that makes you think that they can do the things that they promise to do. It's not made up. It doesn't feel made up. It doesn't feel put on. It
Hmm.
feels real. It just seems to me that you're right. It does open up the possibility that our concept of leadership needs to be broader. And it has evolved. I mean, from the time when we thought that every president had to have a military background, or the best leaders were the ones who could show up in uniform. And,
Hmm.
and I have nothing against those people who have military backgrounds,
Hmm.
but I think we're in an era now where we're understanding the challenges to not only our politics and democracy, but to our humanity. And that people willing to show their humanity in sincere ways are perfectly pitched for leadership today
And so needed.
and absolutely needed.
Showing our humanity would be probably a really great thing across all issues.
And I think we're hearing that. I think that
Yes.
we're seeing it, and as we get to know both
Hmm.
the candidates more, but particularly Vice President Harris more, I think we will understand that how she presents really
Mhm.
is an honest portrayal of who she is.
And back to that original quote that you were talking about, transforming that we've only thought of leadership as male. What would it actually mean for the girls and boys in our country, or, even just for the world to see us elect not only our first woman president, but our first Black woman, South Asian woman president?
Well, here's a clue, and that it is important and that it's being realized. When we talk to young people about this potential presidency, people of all genders are engaged. It's not just people who identify as male or people who identify as female, or there seems to be an energy that transcends a lot of these identities. I think it's important because people come with all kinds of identities, and the younger people are understanding that now
Mhm.
more so perhaps than their parents or grandparents. And so I think now it's important that our young people who are going to be the people who are voting for elections, for hopefully for the next 50 years, come into voting age with an understanding that they are represented, that they can be represented among leadership, that you don't have to fit a stereotype, gender, racial, any kind of particular stereotype of leadership. Leadership can come in all different forms and does if we
Mhm.
open our eyes to the reality of the people who are out there trying to become those
Mhm.
leaders.
And do you feel, are we ready to do this? There's a lot of history making and milestones in one. Do you think we're ready as a country to do this?
Some of us are. At least some of us are. And I
Hopefully
think
the majority.
hopefully the people who will go out and vote. And I think we're ready for it. I think the circumstances that we are in now, the divisions are what's making us ready. We're realizing that we seem to be kind of stuck and that we need some new energy and new ways of thinking to get us out of where we are right now.
Black women have long been such a powerful, influential, and largely unappreciated or acknowledged political force in our country. What are your thoughts on that? I feel like it would almost be especially symbolic and fitting if we did elect our first Black woman president. Is it finally time to let Black women lead?
Oh, it's been time to let us lead.
Yes.
But then it hasn't always been granted or the
Mhm.
willingness to allow us to lead. But, I've been thinking about the different leaders that we've had in the past, and each one has made their mark. Somebody like Shirley
Yeah.
Chisholm or Barbara
Mhm.
Jordan
Mhm.
or Fannie Lou Hamer we have been leading, we are leading.
Mhm.
And I see a connection between those and where Kamala Harris is today. She didn't just exist out of nothing. She exists because of a pathway that was made, and certainly I'd say made, if not
Mhm.
at least contributed to, by Black women leaders from the past. I think that we are ready right now as a
Mhm.
country. And as we do recognize Vice President Harris's candidacy, I hope that we're also going to recognize the contributions to getting to this point that these women that have contributed to not only Vice President Harris's thinking, but to our thinking as a country.
And I just want to also acknowledge you made history. You contributed to this as well, paving the way for a reckoning in sexual harassment and sparking the Year of Women running for Congress and all of these things. How do you think about your role in history? And what advice do you have on making history, especially when you're up against various systemic barriers that are in front of you?
I think what we have to do is really capture this moment and not just see it as, okay, well, this is where we are now, but really think about how we got here and how can we build on that because it's still questionable where we are right now. We'll know more in November, I hope. But we've got to be cognizant that it doesn't stop here. And so when I think about my contributions, I don't really want to be locked into 1991. I did not want that to be the only thing that I would be remembered by, that I would be congratulated for. I think that there's more to be done. And I hope that as long as I live, I will continue to make contributions that will help really broaden our thinking and bring in from all kinds of backgrounds and identities. But of course, especially those people who look like me and who share some of the experiences that I have had.
Well, and you have been continuing to do that as somebody who's interviewed you around all your work and your various books and projects. So thank you for all that you've been doing. Speaking about that in terms of diversity, why is diversity in leadership important?
It's so obvious to me. It's just how can people think that it's not
Hmm.
important? Well, it's important because the world that we grew up in, or that I grew up in, you're younger than I am, was sort of stereotyped. And we were set to believe that there was one way to define the family, there was one way to define relationships, marriage, there was one way to define any number of things that we now understand are being challenged.
Hmm.
There was one way to think about race. And now we understand that there are multiple ways because race gets embodied in different ways. We need contributions to the thinking because the needs and the that people have are diverse. And we need people who can think about what those needs are, the needs for leadership, the need for services, the need for governance, and being participants in the democracy are all shaped by our experiences. And we need people with diverse experiences and leadership who understand that. And so that's why I think it's important. Our leaders need to understand that there is not any solution that will fit everybody. There's no one size fits all solution for any particular problem that I know of in this society today, whether it's economic problems or social problems or problems with the criminal justice system, problems around reproductive health and justice, and certainly no one solution around racial justice. But we can get to the right solutions if we have a diversity of thinking and acting.
Yeah, absolutely. It's always hard when you talk generally. So I'm going to say many people believe not all women, but many women bring different attributes to leadership. In general, what are your thoughts on what women bring and why it's important to have women in leadership?
One of the things that women bring, and this is again not all, is an understanding of people who have, in one form or another, lived as an outsider and who have had some aspects of their lives controlled by their identity. They've had bodily autonomy
Mhm.
controlled by society. So when questions come up that whether they're political or in social settings about issues that are related, women have a different understanding. I was once asked by a journalist, he was trying to make the point about fear of in racism and whether something was racist. When people feared, for example, if they were walking at night and they saw a Black man coming toward them on a dark street? Are they fearful? Is their fear racist? And I said, I can't answer that question without thinking about myself as a woman. If I'm walking at night and I'm in a dark parking lot or on a dark street and I see a man, I don't care what race they are, and I'm there alone, I'm going to be somewhat fearful and guarded about that experience. That's a different thing than saying it's simply racist or it's simply sexist. It's really about what we know our experiences with violence are in reality. You can't just boil it down to people's identity as you see them today. You can't boil everything down to that one snapshot of a person. You've got to think about what their experiences or the experience of people who look like them are. And you certainly can't boil it down to a snapshot if you're a leader of a country. You've got to think about the experiences of a lot of people in this country. Right now, we're dealing not only with issues of gender-based violence, immigrant populations whose experiences are different, economically different. They're different in terms of background. They're different from the politics of places that they're coming from. I mean, all of these things have to be taken into account.
Mhm.
And so if we aren't taking all of those things into account, we're never going to be able to solve the problems. And frankly, we have to take into account some of the experiences of people who are in this country who also feel like they're being disenfranchised. Not necessarily people of color, they may be people from red states. And so we have to have somebody who can really understand all of the diversity that is in this
Mhm.
country and act accordingly as
Mhm.
leaders to that diversity.
Even just some of the examples that you just gave, but I always think of like the panel of all white men during, I guess there were trials on sexual assault in the military, and there were no women there. We stand poised to perhaps elect our first female president, this huge glass barrier and milestone. At the same time, where across the country, there are places where women literally don't have control over their own bodies, their healthcare
Mhm.
decisions. Back, from women didn't have the right to vote, or they were properties of their husband, all of these things that we have lived through. How do you feel about where we are in this moment in terms of the status of women?
Really kind of frightening when
Yeah.
you think that there are people who are leaders
Mhm.
who are willing, in fact, seeming to look forward to being able to monitor women's reproduction, pregnancies. I think that is well beyond anything that I thought we could ever even contemplate as a
Mhm.
country. Privacy issues and medical issues monitored by the state. If you look at that as a marker, then
Mhm.
we're in a very, very frightening place. I hope never becomes the law of the land, but I hope it never happens to anyone. So we are in a scary place where those kinds of ideas are spoken out loud. That is something that we really need to be taking into account in terms of how we move forward. It just, I can hardly even speak when I think about the possibility of that.
You alluded to this earlier in terms of that, if anything, hopefully the fact that we can see the repercussions, the fact that Donald Trump elected all of these anti-choice justices to the Supreme Court, and you know better than anyone about the importance of people who are on our Supreme Court, that maybe hopefully it's had the effect of people really being more aware of how important it is to be civically engaged, how important it is to vote, particularly in this election.
I also think that in part is the contrast between the two candidates are clear
Mhm.
to people that, these are two very different people. I mean, you've got not only Donald Trump saying that he would consider or he would support the monitoring of people's pregnancies, but you also have him being entirely dismissive of violence and rape.
Mhm.
And the idea of it, this seems to him to be inconsequential or not important. I mean, he himself said, he could do whatever he wanted to a woman, nothing would be done because he's
Mhm.
famous. So when you have those kinds of commentary coming from a candidate, you have to ask yourself, is this the person that you would like to put your daughter or child's future in the hands of? Just having those contrasts out there and laid out for people is in terms of what it means. There are clear choices in this election. I'm hoping that people are open and listening.
In thinking about, I mean, it was very hard to get up the day after the 2016 election. And I know that we all don't want to look back with any regrets. What have we learned, do you think, since then? And aside from voting, what is your call to action between now and election day?
Not only voting, you're right. I think one of the things that these conventions have helped us do is to start us talking, just
Mhm.
being in conversation with our neighbors, with our friends, with people who we're in social or professional groups with. Just being in those conversations, having frank conversations about where we are now, and on some of the very fundamental issues like bodily autonomy. And I include not only reproductive justice in that, but I also include violence in the homes and on the streets. The kind of violence against women, especially transgender people, are facing today. And this isn't just a national problem, it's a global problem. We're seeing the emergence of a movement in some African nations as well. So what it says is that this is not just an American problem, but it's one that we should be able and willing to lead on.
Mhm.
But we can't lead on it if we're ignoring it. And that means that we have to continue asking and answering questions about that as a fundamental problem, because I don't think we can separate it from even the reproductive justice issue. It is about our autonomy and control over our bodies and how it gets lost in the political conversation. So I think we have to think broadly about the issues. We have to talk about the issues, and I'm hoping that those talks and the conversations are intergenerational, because I think that that will help bring people with different perspectives, because of generational perspectives,
Mhm.
into not only voting this time, but in the next election and in the next and the next, when maybe some
Mhm.
of us are no longer around. Then I would say, as other than voting, of course, people can make contributions, even small contributions, financial
Mhm.
contributions. Also, people can make calls on behalf of candidates, be a part of those election processes that exist before November 5th, hearing from people and about what the issues are. And I think that the energy that is being created will create a new level of people's engagement, even before they cast their vote.
I know I've had some people ask, almost asking permission to feel hopeful. And I know it's our mutual friend, Gloria Steinem, who always says, like, hope is a form of planning. Are you feeling hopeful?
Oh, I absolutely am. I'm feeling hopeful. I'm always hopeful, though, because
Thank
people
you.
say, "Are you optimistic?" And I say, "Well, I'm not always optimistic, but I'm always hopeful." And now I think I'm optimistic and hopeful. So that's it's a good place to be in. And
Mhm.
you're right, just feeling hopeful, showing that hopefulness, whatever, wherever we turn, even when we get kind of disappointed or feel that things
Mhm.
are not headed exactly the way we want to go, or at the speed that we want it to go in,
Mhm.
then we just have to dig in. We got
Mhm.
to dig into that hope and
Mhm.
get out there and claim what it is we want to happen.
Mhm.
Anyway, we just have to do it.
Yeah.
The stakes are too high
Yeah.
for us to ever, fall back on complacency. And so I'm not only hopeful that there will be some change, but I'm hopeful that there will be real engagement.
I'm particularly hopeful because there also are people in the world that are like you. I was reflecting back on why I reached out to you for an interview for the book all those years ago, 11 years ago. And it really was because you represent sort of like the courage and integrity that you had that propelled you forward to speak out against injustice. And you did confront so many systemic barriers and all these personal attacks. And then you just really, stood up, spoke out for injustice. And I feel like that's what we need. And we need that in our leaders today. So, what do you hope people take away from your example? And what would your advice be to young leaders today?
Well, one of the pieces of advice that I give to young leaders is really that about there is no one size. There's no one model for leadership. Anyone can lead on the issues that they care about. So
Mhm.
if you want to be a leader, don't think that you have to speak like Martin Luther King Jr.
Mhm.
But think about what really drives you, what you really care about, and what your vision for making it happen is. And then use the particular skills and talents that you have to pursue it.
Yeah.
And it's not going to be the same for everyone who is even pursuing the same issue, but you can always bring something unique to your experiences, to your learnings, to your thinking, to a topic, and you can be a leader in that way.